Well, in order to make this Super Mario 2x2 wall art, I guess you can call it, I'm using my crosscut sled. You also can use your miter saw. Crosscut sled's just a lot faster. It's more of a conveyor belt style of cutting the wood. And as you can tell, I've already been cutting some wood, so I'm full of sawdust now. And I'm just making these cubes. So I cut, I believe, 46 to the 1 inch mark, 56 to 1.25 inches, and then there's going to be another 44 down to 1.5. That way I have the 3 layers for the 3 colors, the red, the tan, and the black. The way I do it is I always use a pencil for the smaller stuff because I don't like my finger near the blade. So I set up a stop block on my on my crosscut sled. I push in the piece of wood and then I'll slide it across the blade, but when I pull it back, I'll use my pencil to take out the piece of wood that's in there. That way my hand stays away from the blade as far as possible. Just make sure you have a big thick eraser on your pencil, or else it won't really latch on that much. So I'll just continue that. I'll go back and forth till I have all my pieces cut. Usually I cut a few more just in case. I never know if the sap's going to seep through because the wood's not dry enough. This is all being used from my scrap project. You can still see a little bit of dowel in there from my infinity cube that ended up warping on me. So I just cut all that down, and instead of throwing that wood away, I'm repurposing it towards the Super Mario project. So here's an example of how I use my crosscut sled and just conveyor belt all of this. I'll also move it over to the miter saw. That way you can see another version of it to do. I find the table saw is much more universal for the aspects of what I can do with it than the miter saw, but not everybody has a table saw. It's even possible to do with a hand saw if you're that patient, or you can also do it with a jigsaw and a circular saw with a straight edge. So here's an example of how to do it with the miter saw itself. I use a tapered edge on my stop blocks. That way dust doesn't get in there or sawdust and move my cuts off to the side any bit. I like my cuts to end up being exact every time, because if you did have a bit of sawdust there and you went to go push it in, now you're about 1/8 or 32, you could be 1/16 off. But with that extra angle on there, when you push it in, all that sawdust goes inside and it doesn't affect your cut. So when I have my stop block in place at my 1.5 mark on my miter saw, I clamp it in there nice and tight so it can't move. And then I take my stock that I'm going to be using, butt it up against that, throw on the hearing protection and the eye protection, and then I make my cut that way. One thing to note when you are using a stop block on a miter saw, you can have a tendency of pinching your piece in between your stop block and the blade itself. That is why whenever you saw me making the cut, I'd make the cut all the way down, I'd let go of the motor, I'd pull the piece away so that it doesn't get any burning on it, just in case, and then I wait for the saw blade to stop before I pull it back up. The reason for that is you have little teeth on the end of your blade. If you pull that back up, you can pinch your piece that you just cut between the tooth and your stop block, causing it to tilt like this, and then it'll grab onto a tooth while it is coming up and it'll have a kickback. Or you can possibly have it where if you didn't pull this one away and you do the same maneuver, it can pull this piece in, possibly cutting your hand in the same operation. And there we have all of our pieces cut. I believe it's in and around 150, somewhere around there. My math's not too good right now. It's pretty early still. So I have my, starting from the bottom, 1-inch pieces. Then I go to my 1.25 inch pieces all the way up to my 1.5 inch. That just adds the noticeable 1/4 inch difference in the step ups so you can actually see the definition in the picture itself. So the next step now is I'm just going to be taking my sanding block. I'm going to be taking down the edges because there's always a little bit of frays on the edges. Once that's all done, I'm not going to bring it down to 220 because everything's going to be painted over top of it with the nice spray paint. And once that's done, everything's put into place. I'm going to arrange everything first on the board it's going to be going on. Still have yet to decide if I'm going to do 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch backer board for it. I also don't know if I'm going to do a design on the back yet, but we'll see with that. It's a good idea. Probably should. But let's get sanding. So as you can see here, I just quickly laid everything out on a backer board. I want to get a rough feel and an idea of what it's going to look like once it's done. That way I know before I go to the paint up that I do have the correct pieces. And turns out I do. I have even more than I need, which is good. So what I'll be doing next is just using a block sander and knocking down those rough edges on the sides, like I mentioned before. And to note, I do separate them in boxes just for ease of transportation, and it's a good way of sorting it so I don't lose track of which ones are what. And then once they're all sanded down, I'll be taking them to the spray paint area, which is just outside, and then you will get to see what all the blocks look like painted shortly. So I know that I promised to show how I made it instead of just showing it made, but I had some free time during some work hours, so I just sat down and I put them together. I ended up using the photo from my phone and I just copied it. But what I ended up doing was I put some super glue onto the blocks themselves, sprayed some accelerator onto the backer board, and then when I stuck them, just their weight pressing down is surely strong enough to keep them there. Good thing about accelerator and super glue is once it touches, it's bonded forever. But this is just a first time experiment. As you can tell right about boop, there is a slight gap due to the fact that I did not mill the 2x2s down prior to. Plus I also figured out that I'm not going to be building it so thick. So instead of a 1, 1.25 and 1.5 inch blocks, I'm going to be bringing it down to 1/2 inch, 3/4 and 1 inch blocks. It's just too much weight for the backer board, plus it sticks out too much. It's not an acoustic style of art where it will reflect the sound off and make everything sound so much better, so there's no need for it to be so thick. But I do like the way it turned out. It works out. Good little depth in there just from the different shapes and different sizes. And as you can tell from what I originally mentioned, I said I was only going to be doing red, black, and tan. I ended up adding in a blue there because Mario always has a, well, for the most part has blue pants. So since I did this one, now my son wants a Pikachu one. So I guess my next set of pixelated wood art is going to be a Pikachu or multiple types of Pokemon all in one. So stay tuned, make sure you check it out, and don't forget to subscribe and like.